Capcom continues its streak of porting Resident Evil games to the Nintendo Switch, this time with Resident Evil 5 and 6. Just this week, new demos for these two games were released, showcasing a decent chunk from each game and giving us an idea of how these titles have turned out on the Nintendo Switch. And to discuss it, I am joined by my good friend and colleague, Richard Ledbetter.
Hey John, so this is interesting, isn't it? Because we've seen prior Resident Evil ports to the Switch, most recently Resident Evil 4, right? And that was pretty awesome.
Yeah, that's the thing, these games have existed on different platforms in the past, and they all come from different places and different engines, but obviously 5 and 6 were developed for PS3 and 360 using Capcom's in-house MT framework engine. And the results are interesting, to say the least.
You're a bit disappointed, aren't you? Let's cut to the chase here.
I'm pretty disappointed with what we have here. So, at first glance, they actually look okay. Let's kick off with Resident Evil 5. So, in docked mode, you get 1080p, handheld mode 720p. That's great to start with, even if the AA is a little blurrier than you get on Xbox One or PS4. Not a big deal, though. This is clearly derived from those versions, however, so it has the wider FOV and some changes to certain effects, like the way the heat wave effect works, and the depth of field is affected by the resolution, and there's various things like that make it look a little different. But they actually took things further on Switch, and for me, this is a huge one. They disabled the object motion blur entirely.
Wow.
And that sounds like a small gripe, but I feel that was a huge part of Resident Evil 5's presentation. They had this excellent shutter speed setting, so like every punch and movement of the weapon, like it just felt incredible. And I loaded this up on Xbox 360 last night as well, and you just immediately see like, oh yeah, it looks better in motion with that. And on 360, they actually disable motion blur in split screen mode only, which we'll talk more about. So now, PS4 and Xbox One and everything, they have motion blur. The shutter speed is lower, but they run at 60 FPS, so it's not a big deal.
And do they run at 60 frames per second, though?
Ah, that's true. The original Resident Evil 5 port, even on those platforms, was not quite as good as it could have been. And if you played it on a base PS4 or base Xbox One, you're right, it was not stable 60 FPS. It was closer, but it was not as good as it could be. And I suppose that this might give us an idea of why things have turned out this way on Switch.
Right, okay, but we're looking at Xbox One X footage here, and it doesn't actually have X support, does it? So it's literally using the backwards compatibility extra grunt to kind of force its way to 1080p 60, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Xbox One X and PS4 Pro, so I hear, both solve this problem entirely, giving you 60 FPS. But again, the main issue here comes down to the choices made on the Switch. And, well, actually, before we talk about performance, I do have to mention I also loaded up the game on the Shield, NVIDIA Shield TV, I guess.
I remember this. It's not good, is it?
No. So it says it was ported by NVIDIA Lightspeed Studios, and they've done some good stuff, but perhaps Android was the sort of the issue here. And the Shield, of course, has the same basic hardware design as the Switch overall, I'd say. It's still the Tegra X1, but running Android. And yeah, it's 720p. The frame rate, as we'll see, is abysmal. All the textures have been they're like quarter res, it almost looks like. The shadows are lower resolution, all the shading, the effects, the motion blur, depth of field, everything is like just destroyed. It looks terrible, and it does not even have the expanded FOV of the newer versions. So,
but it is fascinating, isn't it? Because we don't have a hugely positive opinion of the Switch port, but the same hardware running at faster clock speeds in Android is producing this, and it's horrible, isn't it?
So yeah, and
it could have been
right.
worse.
That is a very interesting point. It kind of shows the difference between the dedicated gaming APIs that Nintendo provides on their OS versus what you can do on Android. And yeah, the Switch version has its issues, but it's light years beyond the Shield port. So in that sense, it's not that bad. And again, I think they could have fixed it. And one of the main ways they could have fixed this is by capping the frame rate to 30 frames per second. and possibly lowering the resolution a tad.
So why do you say that?
Basically, they decided to uncap the frame rate on this game. So when you disable motion blur and you uncap the frame rate, what you're left with is a wildly unstable level of performance that very rarely hangs at any specific value for a length of time. So, and it's never a multiple of your screen. So you get a lot of image judder where one frame persists on screen longer than it should. Well, it's more like you'll have one frame that's like, say, 33 milliseconds, then you have like a 50 millisecond and then a 16 millisecond. It's the same reason that, you know, bad frame pacing looks poor, but this is just more the frame rate itself is going up and down all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I shared a lot of that footage with you, so you saw the issue.
Yeah, and it's both in docked and mobile mode, which, you know, to all intents and purposes are effectively the same, just with the resolution differential by the look of it.
Yeah, exactly. And so the demo goes up through this first area where you have to fight the large crowd, sort of the Resident Evil 4 style village sequence, but for RE5. It's a pretty good test because they throw a lot of zombies at you. There's plenty of effects and explosions, and there's just a lot happening. And it really pushes the Switch pretty hard, I think, at the selected settings that they have here.
I think back in the day they were actually using this sequence for the benchmark on the PC version.
Yeah, I actually loaded up the PC version for this because I was testing it out on the CRT.
Right.
And I was amused to find that if I unlocked the frame rate, I was getting like 600 or 700 frames a second now, which is just awesome. But yeah. So, I mean... So the thing is, though, is it's at or above 30 frames per second a decent amount of time. You do get plenty of drops below it, like about 27, 26 FPS. But I feel like if they had capped it at 30, it would have at least felt mostly consistent instead of the juddery mess that it is right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because it really...
It's not great, is it?
No, they really can't get close to 60 frames per second. There just isn't any reason to unlock the frame rate here because you're not getting 60, you're not getting 50, and you rarely ever get 40. So it's just not worth it.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, just for fun, for comparison, the Shield version, as you can see, is significantly lower overall. Sort of kind of hangs more around the 20 frames per second line rather often.
Yeah.
And it's just... And again, you know, it's just... it's not fun. In portable mode, exactly the same kind of thing on Switch. They're both equally poor in terms of like frame consistency, even if the average frame rate isn't actually that low.
Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't feel good to play.
So to summarize then, basically, well, it seems that the frame rate is unlocked and it shouldn't be. It should be a locked 30 FPS, and there are issues with pushing graphics too hard to the point where maybe some sort of DRS solution or, you know, just slightly lowering the resolution would have produced a much more stable experience. But what about visual features? I think we've talked about motion blur. Is there anything else that's different?
So, yeah, the shadows are slightly lower resolution, actually, than the PS4, Xbox One versions, which were enhanced over the original game. But the main thing I've noticed is it's very, very subtle stuff. Like, the color grading is different. The color of blue in the sky, the way the bloom works, things like the heat wave effect, the amount of like smoke particles in certain scenes. At a glance, you would never be able to pick this up, but when you put it side by side with the Xbox 360 version, all of this stuff sort of works together. Like the 360 version just has a grittier but more cinematic look to it, and with the motion blur, like somehow it just feels more impressive to play as a result. It's all the combination of these subtle visual features combined obviously with the more stable frame rate that really help push this version to the top in that sense.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, back in the day, I loved this game. When you actually saw those cutscenes and the level of detail on the characters there, it just looked incredible for the time. And, you know, that does persist into the Switch version, but obviously these days it's not quite so impressive, but it's still got a very distinct aesthetic to it that I just found really appealing. And looking at your footage, I was reminded of, you know, just how good this was back in the day, and I really enjoyed it. But, you know, we do need consistent performance here, and it's disappointing that seems to have been a lower priority versus resolution, which...
Yeah, and one more thing actually I tested was there is split screen functionality here, just like the original game.
Wow.
And you can play it in portable or docked. You can even use two Joy-Con. They actually make it work where a single Joy-Con is quite playable. It's not comfortable, but it works.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem here is that the performance levels in this mode are rather low, we'll say. It kind of hovers between 20 to 25 frames per second, which isn't actually much. The 360 version as well is not that smooth. It's slightly higher on average, I'd say, but they're both pretty jerky in the split screen mode. I think that's just putting a huge drain on the system, because this was a visually intensive game, and obviously the Switch is not handling it that well. So in that sense, yeah, split screen is kind of not great.
Okay, so I think that the takeaway I'm getting here is that the port isn't great as things stand, but the essentials are there, and with some tweaks, could be pretty good.
Yeah, I think honestly most people will probably be okay with it, in the sense that it is still very playable. It's Resident Evil 5 on the go, but the frame rate for me, it's just too unsteady, and the removal of motion blur, the object blur specifically, really changes the look of the game in a way. So I don't feel that it looks or plays as nicely as the 360 version. If the 360 version exactly is what we had on Switch, I think it would be better all around. Oh, and one other thing I forgot to mention, of course, is that weirdly the loading times are actually slower on Switch than they are on Xbox 360 running from a DVD, which I found especially bizarre. So yeah, I mean, it's disappointing overall, I'd say.
Okay. So does any of these findings translate over to Resident Evil 6, or is that a very different animal?
That is a different animal indeed. And I will say that the results here are different. So Resident
that was
Evil
a long
6
pause.
It is, because one of the issues that Resident Evil 6 always had is that when they transitioned over to the new version of MT Framework, they released this on PS3 and Xbox 360, the performance is not good on those systems. It was always a very unstable game. It shipped with a very low FOV, which later was patched in, and just the way the camera works and combined with all of that, it never felt very good on those platforms. But then the PS4, Xbox One, and of course PC versions were all released, and even on the base consoles, it runs great.
Yeah, that's kind of
pretty
bizarre,
much a locked
isn't it?
60 FPS.
Kind of bizarre,
Yeah,
because
it is.
Resident Evil 5 had issues where it was fairly solid on last-gen systems. Xbox 360. Let's not go into the PS3 situation on that one. But Resident Evil 6 had problems on the Xbox 360, but everything was pretty awesome on the Xbox One.
Yeah, it absolutely was. It was a great conversion, and maybe it's just the more modern rendering techniques they were using. The engine somehow played nicer with the new hardware. But either way, it was a great conversion. Now on Switch, we kind of have the same basic visual setup, where unlike RE5, they didn't really sacrifice much. There was no object motion blur in 6, which was disappointing actually at the time. But, it looks pretty much exactly like the other console versions, so it doesn't feel like a step down in any way like that. All of the issues with RE6 center entirely around performance, which is less stable than Resident Evil 5.
Yeah, I had a look at some of your footage here. It's problematic in many places.
Yeah, so let's just kind of start, like, right away, you're kind of in for a bad time. When you're first given control, it's sort of this first-person view with Leon laying on the street, things are on fire. You look up, and the frame rate is hovering between, like, 17 to 22 frames per second on average.
What, is this docked?
Yeah, this is docked. It's this initial scene with the helicopter, and it's really choppy, and I was like, uh-oh, this is not this is not looking good for the Switch. And true enough, like, you keep playing, you keep going forward, and most of the time the frame rate hangs between, say, 25 and 35.
Okay, that's not ideal, is it?
No, and Resident Evil 5 was kind of similar, but this one seems to spend a lot more time below 30. And that's kind of what surprised me the most, especially, so, Leon's section here, there's some pyrotechnics. Like, there's this scene here where you're escaping from an exploding plane and every car in the city starts exploding, and it's absolute insanity. It's pretty much Resident Evil 6 in a nutshell. But there, the frame rate is not great, but it's still playable. The problem is when you get into Chris's chapter, which is what they have available, also set here, the frame rate is actually a lot worse. And this is where it pretty much hangs below 30 frames per second most of the time, with sort of these jumps just into the mid-30s. And that's actually remarkably similar to the PS3 version, I'd say.
Right, okay. So it is unlocked. What about the resolution split on docked and mobile?
Yeah, it's 1080p, 720p again, just like Resident Evil 5. So they actually use the same setup as the Xbox One and PS4 versions, which is curious because it doesn't quite seem like it can cope. Although maybe it's a CPU limitation as well. It's hard to say.
Well, I guess you can look at the frame rate graph, and if there are really heavy GPU elements to it that are causing the drops, it would likely be the GPU that's the issue. And it does kind of sound like that. I mean, if I had the time, I would go and do some overclocking on this one to see what the issue is. But
yeah, that's true.
But it's it's not great, is it?
Most of the dips are associated with where you're looking. If you're looking out over the city, for instance, or in a more complex area, the frame rate immediately tanks.
Right.
Turn around and look towards like a sort of empty area in comparison, it kind of climbs back up to 30 to 35.
Interesting.
So there does seem to be highly tied to what's happening on screen, because unlike RE5, 6 is not broken up into as many small chunks. You still have some loading screens, but each map area is much, much, much larger. I think they must be using data streaming here for RE6 to load in huge chunks of the world. And for whatever reason, though, the Switch just doesn't like it, and the performance during pretty much every combat scene is under 30. So, in that sense, I really can't say that I think too positively of it. It doesn't feel great. But if you were okay with the PS3 or 360 version in terms of frame rate, then, it's still somewhat acceptable, I suppose. The problem, though, is then if you want to play in split screen mode, it's even worse than RE5.
Right. Okay.
Where it's almost consistently under 20 in many scenes. And it still supports the dual Joy-Con setup that you could do with RE5, but because it's a right-stick camera-based game, and you don't have a second stick in that mode, essentially you have to hold the run button, which is, I guess, B, on the Switch controller, to sort of recenter the camera. So you constantly need to sort of tap the B button to sort of recenter the camera and change your view. You can't freely look around. And when you do aim your weapon, then the left stick becomes sort of the stick for aiming. So it's playable to a degree, but it's not great in that mode. Not that you would necessarily want to do that, but still, having co-op and tabletop mode is cool, and it does work in RE5. It just doesn't work very well here, unless you have like 2 sets of Joy-Con or an extra Pro controller or something.
Yeah, well, that's a bit of a disappointment all around, really. I mean, Resident Evil 6 was very contentious when it launched, but I think it's a game that people have come to appreciate more over time.
Yeah, I've actually always had an appreciation for it in the sense that, it has flaws, yes, but the core combat system and some of the scenarios they've built are really well done. The combat itself is extremely deep. There are a lot of things you can do in this combat system. The problem is the game doesn't teach you any of it. Right. And you can still kind of get through it by stumbling around, playing it kind of the less fun way, which is maybe a problem in and of itself. But once you really get into running and dodging and sliding around on the floor and doing melee attacks, and it really works pretty well, and I do like playing it.
But not on Switch.
I just wouldn't recommend just not on Switch.
Fair enough. Can this one be saved then? I mean, for Resident Evil 5, you were saying that resolution tweaks and a frame rate cap could essentially put that in a really decent position. But what about this one?
I'm less confident in this one. I feel like the frame rate is just under 30 enough at this point, where while a cap would help make it feel more consistent, it would still not be running as well as I feel like it could. But then again, if you were okay with the PS3 version last generation, or even the 360 version, this is very similar in terms of the way that it runs, which is not a compliment, but and that's always the thing with judging frame rates, right? So, to some people this might be totally playable, but to my eyes it's just visually unattractive with how juddery and unstable it looks. So That's why I might be coming off as more harsh than usual, because they just happen to pick the areas that I find very, very distracting. So I'm not sure I'm going to be able to enjoy playing through these games on the Switch.
It's difficult because lower performance was almost a signature of the last generation in many ways. I mean, it's why I developed the frame rate analysis tools way back in the day. I think it was for Grand Theft Auto 4. Yeah, where we just kind of needed to get some metrics on what was actually happening there, because performance was so poor, and obviously across the generation, getting locked frame rates was actually quite rare. It's much more commonplace in the current generation systems, but when you kind of get a flashback to how things were like this, it just doesn't feel right anymore, does it?
No, it doesn't, and that's one of the reasons actually why I always felt that Resident Evil 5 on 360 was such an accomplishment, because it actually is very stable for the most part. There's a few moments of screen tearing here and there, but overall it's mostly a locked 30 FPS, and they had that very clever dynamic anti-aliasing solution.
Oh, yeah.
If you recall, where it would use 4x MSAA most of the time, but as performance would hit, it would drop to 2x, and eventually it could disable it if the frame rate dropped. If the performance hit was high enough. So very, very clever stuff. And I don't think MSAA survived here to this new version either, I should note. So,
right, yeah.
No surprise there.
Yeah, it would make sense really for a mobile orientated platform. But yeah, interesting stuff. And I kind of would be hoping for a Resident Evil 5 DF Retro at some point, based on this conversation mostly.
We're kind of getting there. It looks like it is 10 years old, so
wow, good stuff.
It is now retro. But I think that's going to do it for now, so thanks for joining me, Rich.
No probs.
And if you guys enjoyed this video, as always, be sure to like and subscribe, ring the notification bell at the top, and of course, follow us both over on Twitter. And until next time, this is John and Rich signing off.